Before his high-stakes missions, John Smith's life was defined by resilience and hardship in a small Texas town. Born Herman Monster to Bill and Frida, who loved vintage sitcoms, John faced constant teasing for his unusual name. Determined to distance himself from it, he endured schoolyard fights and stern home lectures. After high school, he sought purpose and enlisted in the Marines. 6 tough years, including deployments in harsh desert conditions, caught the attention of secret recruiters. These recruiters brought him to Sector Alpha, a covert organization where John took on the cover of an ordinary IT specialist. His unassuming appearance and friendly demeanor made him perfect for blending in unnoticed. The company, as insiders called it, valued his discreet nature and strategic mind. During this time, he met Houston, a lively and trusting woman in a computer class arranged by the agency. They married and shared simple joys, although her occasional naivety sometimes worried him. Returning home one evening, John parked in the garage, savoring the sight of Houston's car and the anticipation of their reunion. Entering the house, he was greeted by the aroma of her cooking. The warmth of home reminded him of his many roles, from soldier to covert operative to devoted husband. This evening promised a rare moment of peace. Houston, who worked as a legal secretary, knew John's job involved travel but not its true nature. His cover as a globe-trotting IT troubleshooter allowed him to gather intelligence, though he didn't dwell on what the company did with it. Occasionally, he had to use his training, leaving him unsettled. That night, he walked into the familiar scent of lasagna, one of his favorite meals. The dining table was set with their wedding china, signaling a special evening. As he turned his head upstairs, Houston appeared, stunning him in a short black dress that left little to the imagination. Her long, dark hair framed her face, and high heels completed the look, promising a night that would help him forget the weight of his secret life. "How do you like it?" she asked, spinning to show off her dress. He noticed she wore only tiny underwear underneath and fought the urge to rip them off. "Wow," he said, "you look incredible." She laughed as he lifted her easily. "Don't mess up my makeup," she said. "What's the occasion?" he asked, eyeing the fancy china on the table. "For our guest," she said. "Guest? But there are only 2 plates," he noted. "Where will the guest sit?" she replied, "at the head of the table." A sense of unease settled over J.N. "Where's my plate?" he asked. "We need to talk," Maria said, her voice tinged with nerves. "Talk about what?" Junk's eyes narrowed. "First, who is this guest?" Maria questioned. "My boss, Greg Wilson," she answered, glancing away. Junk's expression darkened. "You mean that guy who thinks he's God's gift to women?" he asked. "That's your perspective," Maria countered. "HEK is actually nice, and you'd like him if you got to know him." "I highly doubt that," John said, crossing his arms. "Keep going." "You remember the position I mentioned applying for?" Maria asked. "Yes, some executive role," John replied. "Exactly. Greg and the partners are considering me for it. It could mean more money for us, but I'd also have to travel to New York and Paris occasionally. Isn't that exciting?" "What's the catch?" he asked, as she grew more nervous. "It means I may need to, provide extra services to Greg and the partners," she said hesitantly. "Extras as in sex?" he asked bluntly. "Yes," she said, "but it won't change anything for us. Greg says most men secretly want to see their wife with another man." "What else did he tell you?" John asked, trying to control his anger. "He told me to call you a deceived husband and not let you touch me without his approval," she said. "He's coming tonight to make your dream come true," Maria added, her voice wavering. Junk's jaw tightened. "We have a serious problem, Houston." "Problem? What do you mean?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Have I ever given any reason to believe I'd want that?" Jan demanded. "No, but Greg insists that most men don't know they want it until they experience it," she replied. "So let me get this straight. You invited Greg to my house to sit at my table, use our best china, and then sleep with you in our bed?" Junk's voice was ice. "Yes, that's the plan," she admitted. "Did he promise it'd be fun?" John pressed. "Yes, he said you'd eventually get used to it," she said softly. "Have you slept with him already?" John's stare was unflinching. "No," Maria replied, shaking her head. He wants the first time to be in front of you. Jae-in took a deep breath, his eyes locked on hers. Listen carefully. If you ever call me a deceived husband, I'll make sure no one ever finds your body. Maria's face blanched at his words, stunned. Second, if Greg steps into my house and disrespects me, I'll handle him myself. And third, if you love me and want this marriage to work, call him now and quit your job. But she's already on her way, she whispered, fear flickering in her eyes. One last question. Do you really want to stay married? Yes, she said. Then go upstairs and change, he ordered. I'll handle Greg. But he's bigger than you and knows karate, she protested. You're just a programmer. I said I'll handle it. Go change now. She ran upstairs, crying. John was left thinking about what to do with his unfaithful wife. Divorce was too risky, as it might reveal his real identity. The agency had methods for handling such issues, but turning her into an emotionless shell didn't sit right with him. He trusted she hadn't cheated yet, but the chance remained. The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to a tall, muscular man. You must be Greg, John said. Yeah, Greg replied, pushing past him with a smirk. John hated that and restrained the urge to break his neck. Come in, John said, closing the door. Greg glanced at him and laughed. So, the deceived husband? No, John said calmly. I'm Houston's husband. Same thing, Greg scoffed. Give me a drink, he demanded. Screw you, John said. I'm not your servant. What did you just say? Greg snapped, surprised at the defiance. I said, screw you. Are you deaf too? John repeated. Greg's face darkened. I'll crush you. Do you know who I am? Yes, the guy who's been filling my wife's head with nonsense, John replied. Where is she? Greg demanded. She's coming, John said, as Houston appeared in jeans and a t-shirt. Why aren't you wearing the dress I bought? Greg asked angrily. I didn't feel like it, she said. Greg turned to John. Make her change. Why don't we discuss this in my office? John suggested. There's nothing to discuss, Greg said. Perfect, John replied with a smile. I'll just eliminate you here then. Is that a threat? Greg sneered. No, it's a promise, John said coolly. Houston tried to interject, but John signaled for her to stop. 5 minutes in my office. If you're still standing after, do whatever you want, Greg grinned arrogantly. I was a state karate champ. You really want this? 5 minutes, John said. But you'll beg for mercy, Greg warned. John led the way to the basement and gestured for Houston to follow. She hesitated, shocked at her husband's demeanor, but complied. Once downstairs, John had Houston sit against the wall. Greg faced him, smirking. Well, now what? Greg asked. Waiting. Waiting on you, John said. Greg mocked him, kneeling and putting his hands behind his back. Afraid to strike a man like this. Afraid? Greg spat. In seconds, John subdued Greg. If anyone asks, you slipped on the soap, John whispered. Greg nodded weakly. I didn't hear you, John pressed. I understand, Greg managed. Good, remember, I know 1,000 ways to end you. Don't test me, John said. Now, good night, Gracie. He knocked Greg out. John took out his phone, cleaned up the second line, and said, Thanks, he said, ending the call. He turned to Houston, who sat in stunned silence. He's dead, John said. No, but he'll have a bad headache, he added. Who are you? She asked. Don't you know your own husband? John replied. I thought you were just a programmer, she whispered. John grinned. All programmers can do this, he said. No, not all programmers, she responded. I've seen Greg defeat larger opponents, break bricks and boards, but you took him down in seconds. He didn't stand a chance. No matter how strong you are, there's always someone stronger, John said. I was angry and motivated. Lucky I didn't eliminate him. What happens to us now? She asked. That depends, John replied. On what? She pressed on. On your honesty? When the inspector arrives, John said. Inspector? What does that mean? She asked, her voice nervous. It's a device my company uses to verify testimony, he explained. And if I fail? She asked, her voice trembling. Don't think about that, he said. Did you mean it when you said you'd eliminate me if I called you that? She asked, a tear rolling down her cheek. John met her eyes as she shivered, and he added, My mother cheated on my father for years. He wanted a divorce but couldn't afford to lose everything, so he stayed for us. She humiliated him daily, calling him that word until it broke him. One day, after my younger brother left for college, he threw away his ring, said goodbye at the bar, and drove off a cliff. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, John. I believed Greg's lies. Can you forgive me? She asked. We'll see, after the check, John said, as the doorbell rang. He opened the door to 3 men in white suits. 2 placed Greg on a stretcher and took him outside. The third man pulled out a tablet with a connected device. Miss, the inspector said, we'll be recording your testimony. This device measures your skin response and other indicators more accurately than a polygraph. Please answer truthfully. State your full married name. Houston Smith, she replied. Your age, 26. The inspector cast a quick glance at John and gave a nod. John took a deep breath and asked, Houston, have you cheated on me since we got engaged? No, she answered, shaking her head. Have you had any sexual relations with anyone during that time? No, she repeated firmly. Has anyone touched you intimately? John's voice was steady but strained. No, Houston said. John's voice wavered as he continued. Were you planning to have sex with Greg tonight? Yes, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. Why? John's eyes searched hers for an explanation. Greg told me you'd want it, that you loved me enough to allow it, Houston sobbed. What else did he tell you? John pressed. He said that all married men dream of seeing their wives with someone else, she confessed. And you believed him? John's tone carried disbelief. Yes, I'm so sorry, John. You travel so much, and I thought it would make you happy, she said, her voice breaking. Were you offered a job that required relationships with management? He asked, the tension in the room palpable. Yes, she whispered. Would it involve clients too? John's expression hardened. Probably, Houston admitted, looking down. Do you think I'd approve of this? He asked, eyes narrowed. They said you'd resist at first, but eventually accept it, she replied. Did they imply there would be consequences if I didn't? John's tone darkened. Yes, it felt like a threat, Houston admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Do some women at your company have to go through this? John asked, eyes narrowing. Yes, she said, looking down. And do their partners support it? He continued. As far as I know, yes, she replied, wiping a tear. Have you talked to any of their partners directly? John pressed. No, it's just what some of the women told me. They said it brought in extra money over time, Houston explained. So others are getting paid for it? John asked, needing clarity. Yes, she confirmed. John's expression softened for a moment. Do you love me? Tears streamed down her face. Yes, more than anything, she said, voice trembling. Will you quit right now? John's tone was firm. She nodded, resolute. Would you sue if it came to that? He asked, searching her eyes. Yes, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, Houston said, desperation in her voice. Are you just saying this because it's what I want to hear? John's gaze was unwavering. No, John, I'm truly sorry. I believe those lies. Please trust me, she pleaded. Jan glanced at the inspector's tablet, then at him. The inspector nodded. Houston, stay here. I'll be back, John said, then walked upstairs with the inspector. So John asked in the living room. She's telling the truth, right? The inspector said, Alpha 1 wants to talk. He activated the app, and Regis Carlisle, Alpha 1, appeared on the screen, his sharp gaze fixed on John. John, I hear your return home was eventful, Regis said. Yes, sir, John replied. Could have been better. I've reviewed the results. What are your thoughts? Regis asked. My gut says to kick her out, John admitted. No one would blame you, Regis said. But there's more you should know. What do you mean? John asked. A divorce could expose your ties to Alpha. That wouldn't end well for either of you, Regis said. I understand, John acknowledged, aware of Alpha Sector's strict secrecy. We've been watching Omega partly due to data you brought in, Regis continued, surprising John. That includes monitoring your wife. While her judgment has been poor, she hasn't crossed any lines. Good to know, John said. What can you tell me about Omega? Not over this call, Regis said. But it's time to bring Houston in. Think you can handle that? I believe so, John said. Good. Tell her only what's necessary, and bring her to my office at 7 a.m. sharp. She doesn't have clearance, John pointed out. She will by then. Technically, she's already part of this, just unaware, Regis replied. John processed this. If true, Houston would have no choice but to cooperate. The alternatives were unsettling. Have dinner, talk, and bring her in tomorrow, Clear Regis asked. Yes, boss, John said. By the way, letting Greg live was technically wrong. How's he doing? He's in a coma, Regis said. If he wakes up, he'll have amnesia. We'll handle any issues. John nodded. See you tomorrow, Regis said, ending the call. The inspector put away his device and left. See you, he said as he walked out. Jan went back downstairs. Houston sat in the chair, wiping her eyes. She looked up as he entered. I messed up, didn't I? She said. Jan replied, I'm so sorry, John. I believed Greg's lies and never meant to hurt you. I'll pack and go. You deserve better. She stood, but John stopped her. Stay, he said. I accept your apology, and I owe you one too. For what? She asked, surprised. For being gone so much. My job is complicated. I understand, she said. No, you don't, John said. First, John Smith isn't my real name. Then who are you? She asked. Was the story about your dad true? Yes, he said. I was born Herman Monster in North Texas. Herman, she laughed. Yes, Jan said, smiling. It wasn't fun growing up with that name. After the Marines, I became John Smith. You were a Marine, she asked, surprised. There's a lot you don't know, he said. Let's eat, and I'll tell you more. Is the lasagna still warm? He asked. Yes, it's in the oven, she said. Perfect. Let's eat and talk, he said. Does this mean you forgive me? She asked. We'll see, he replied, offering his hand. She smiled, took it, and stood up. Houston listened quietly as John revealed the story he'd hidden for years. She barely touched her lasagna while he described his childhood as Herman Monster, his military service, and his recruitment by Sector Alpha, a covert government intelligence agency. He explained the name change and assured her it was all legal. You don't seem like a secret agent, she said softly. He laughed. Not everyone's a muscle-bound action star. The less noticeable you are, the better. Most of my job is boring, just gathering information. Did they teach you how to handle Greg? She asked. Yes, he said. I had martial arts training, and they built on that. I don't use it often, but I can defend myself. What level are you? She asked. Greg claimed to be a 5th-degree black belt. I have a leather one, he joked, showing his belt. Very funny, she said, smiling, before turning serious. What happens to us now? She asked. That's up to you, he said. We're meeting my boss tomorrow. HEK is tougher than I am. What time? She asked. 7 a.m. So we need to leave by 5:30, he said. We should get to bed early, she suggested, taking his hand. John, I never meant to hurt you. Well, you did, he said. It'll take time to work through this. The only reason you're still here is because you didn't follow through. I need to know why you thought I'd want this. It took months, she said. The pressure really ramped up a few weeks ago. Greg and others showed me articles. They said all men secretly wanted it. They convinced me it was great. I resisted at first, but they wore me down. One woman even told me it saved her marriage. But you never asked their spouses or me, John said. It's hard to believe you fell for it, he added. They told me not to tell you that it was meant to be a surprise, she said. That's what tonight was supposed to be. Well, it backfired on Greg, Jan said. Yes, it did, she agreed quietly. You mentioned threats if I didn't comply, Jan said. What kind of threats? They said their security force would come after you, she replied. Siloviki, John asked. Yes, she said. Greg was in charge of them. They protect the company's leaders. They're ex-military, intimidating men. They won't be happy about Greg. John said no, she admitted. What did they say could happen to me? He asked. Accidents, car failures, attacks, she said. They implied you could be harmed. I understand, John said. We'll make sure that doesn't happen. Promise me you'll be safe, she said. Everything will be fine, he assured her, hiding his own worry. Let's go to bed and handle this tomorrow, she said. Okay, he replied. I'll take care of the dishes. Houston cleared the table while John checked the house's security. He then went to his office, opened the tool safe, loaded a .045 pistol, and placed it in his bedside drawer. Afterward, he prepared for bed. John recalled Regis's words about reconnecting with Houston and intended to do just that. They lay together, made love, and she whispered, I love you. You're the only man for me. Of course, he replied, wanting to focus only on that moment. They embraced and fell asleep. In the morning, they woke early. John showered and shaved, while Houston made coffee. Then they switched places as he got dressed and double-checked the security system. He poured coffee and warmed rolls for the road when Houston came down. They grabbed their things and left. Houston was surprised when they arrived at what seemed to be a junkyard. Is this your office? She asked. John smiled. Not everything is what it seems, he said. He parked near a portable toilet. Hand me your phone, he said, after disabling the tracking software. He handed it back. They were following you, he explained. They were tracking me, she asked, stunned. Yes, now let's go, he said. Regis was waiting. John led her into the portable toilet, which turned out to be an elevator. As it descended, Houston realized its purpose when the door opened. A guard in camouflage asked for her ID. He scanned it and verified her identity with a retinal scan before allowing them through. Alpha 1 is expecting you, the guard said. John led Houston down a hallway to a large marble foyer marked with Alpha Sector and the motto, First Line of Defense. Another wall read, Our enemies do not sleep, and neither do we. They stepped onto an emblem that lowered them into a room filled with monitors and personnel. A large man with an eye patch approached. Regis Carlyle introduced himself. Call me Mr. Carlyle or Regis, he said. You must be Houston, he added. Yes, she replied, shaking his hand. Interesting name, Regis said. My parents named me after the city I was conceived in, she explained. Good thing it wasn't Toddsack, Arkansas, he joked. She chuckled. True. Come into my office, he said. Inside the glass walls, darkened for privacy. Sorry, but I've never heard of Alpha Sector, Houston said. That's good, Regis replied. If you had, we'd have a security issue. Oh, she said. So what do you do? We gather global intel, analyze it, and act if needed, Regis said. Your husband is one of our top operatives, he added, looking at John. By the way, Mr. Wilson is alive, but in a coma. Your handling of him was impressive, he said, turning to JN. But kneeling was risky, Regis added. I thought it was the best option, John admitted. Regis nodded. Don't do that again, he said, turning to Houston. How long have you known about the leadership support team? He asked. About 2 or 3 months, she replied. What did they tell you initially? He asked. They said it was a prestigious team that supported executives and involved lots of travel, a promotion, and bonuses for both me and JN, she answered. When did you learn about the sexual side? Regis asked, narrowing his eyes. 2 weeks ago, when John was on his last mission, Houston answered. Regis nodded and brought up footage on the screen. Look at this, he said, showing a recording of Linda Wharton's private conference room. Houston gasped. How did you get this? She asked. Through the TV's built-in camera, Regis explained. You might have heard rumors about this online. I thought it was just a conspiracy theory, Houston said. Exactly what you should have thought, Regis replied, pressing play. The video showed Linda offering Houston coffee, adding something to it, and handing it to her. Pause, John said. Just pause the footage. Good observation. Linda likely sedated the coffee. We'll get back to that, he said, resuming the video. Linda told Houston the senior partners were excited for her to join the team and inquired about her husband's support. Houston confirmed John was supportive and loving. That's great, Linda said. Now there's an aspect of the job we haven't mentioned, providing personal services to managers and sometimes clients. This includes sex. Houston, shocked, asked, "You expect me to cheat on my husband?" "Not exactly," Linda said. "We'll make sure he's on board and supportive. That's why he'll get bonuses too." Houston hesitated, expressing doubt. Linda reassured her, saying, "By the time we talk to him, he'll be happy for you." It's said that all men secretly desire this, but don't admit it. John never mentioned that Houston said he wouldn't. Linda replied, "But deep down, it's a common fantasy. I want to be part of the team, but not at the expense of my marriage." Houston said, "Don't worry about John. We'll handle him." Linda said, "Just focus on your work and read the materials I send." Houston asked about other women's husbands, and Linda assured her they were happy, enjoying better relationships and checks. "What should I tell JN?" Houston asked. "Nothing for now. We'll manage it," Linda said. "All right," Houston replied. "Good girl," Linda said. "Go back to work, and we'll talk later." The video ended with Linda watching Houston leave, smiling smugly. I paused the video and turned to Houston. "How did you feel after that meeting?" I asked. "I was shocked and confused at first, but then I felt strange," she admitted. "You felt excited, didn't you?" "Like what she said was enticing," Regis asked, blushing. Houston nodded yes. "I even had to go to the restroom," she added. "That was likely due to the pill Linda added to your coffee," Reese said. "Did you feel the same way after every conversation about the team?" "Yes," she said quietly. Regis nodded and showed another video, this time from Linda's office. Linda called a man named George. "George, I spoke with Houston Smith," Linda said. "Will she agree?" he asked. "I'm working on it. I sent her some stories to get her thinking," Linda replied. "To turn her on, you mean?" George said, laughing. "Yes," Linda said. "Her husband's away, right?" George asked. "Yes, I have time to prepare her," Linda said. "By the time he's back, she'll be ready." "I'll handle Smith if he interferes," George said. "Greg will work on him, and we'll use security if needed." "Careful," Linda warned. "If anything happens to him, we'll lose her. Then we'll speed up the plan. I have buyers in the Middle East waiting." George ended the call with 2 weeks before hanging up. "Who is George?" John asked. "George Black, the main partner," Houston said. John glared at Regis. "You knew," he said. "Calm down, John," Regis replied. "I couldn't distract you from your mission. I trusted you to handle Greg, and you did. Your job is to adapt and overcome," Regis continued. "There are more videos, but they repeat what you know." Each meeting involved a pill to manipulate Houston. They were turning her into a tool, and you were the main target. "You heard George mention buyers," Regis said. "We believe Omega is part of a human trafficking ring." "Oh my God," Houston whispered. Regis just displayed photos of 5 missing women. "They all worked for Omega." "I knew some of them," Houston said. "They said they were being transferred and then disappeared. Their husbands were told they were on business trips and kept getting paychecks. Eventually, the husbands reported them missing." "We think they were trafficked," Regis added. "You were next," Houston said. "Can they be saved?" she asked. "I doubt it," Regis replied. "I'd be surprised if they're alive." "So what now?" Jan asked. "Houston can't go back," Regis said. "No, and I believe they're already after her." Regis showed a live feed from their living room, where 4 large men and Linda were inside. "How did they bypass our security?" John asked. "Good question," Regis said, eyeing Houston. "I didn't give them the code," she said nervously. "We'll see what they do," Regis said, watching as Linda's phone rang. Houston's phone chimed seconds later. Regis gestured for her to answer. Houston answered her phone. "Houston, where are you?" Linda's voice demanded. "John and I aren't home," she replied. "What happened to Greg last night?" Linda pressed. "I think he slipped on soap or something," Houston said. "Some soap?" Linda said. "He's in a coma." "What really happened?" "Greg fought with John. John didn't react as you said he would," Houston replied. "This is bad. The senior partners are angry." "Come to the office now," Linda ordered. "I'm done, Linda. I'm resigning," Houston said. "That's not happening." "You made commitments," Linda said. My commitment is to my husband. I'm not doing this. Goodbye, Houston said, ending the call. She looked at John, who nodded in approval. They watched the video as Linda, furious, clicked on her phone and spoke to the men. Her phone's last location is a landfill off Highway 87. Go intercept them, but don't eliminate them. Bring them back alive, she said. The 4 men nodded and left. Linda looked around, then left the room. The video ended. We have an hour before they arrive, Regis said, making a quick call. Operation Yard Dog in 1 hour, he ordered. An hour later, 2 black SUVs arrived at the landfill. 4 men in suits got out and approached John's car, met by 2 men in overalls and caps. John, Houston, and Regis watched on screen. How can we help? One man, Bubba, asked with a thick southern accent. We're looking for the car owner, said a suited man, showing his tool. Bubba called out, Hey T-Bone, this guy's got a toy. T-Bone laughed, raising his rifle. That's a toy. This is real, he said, loading it. The suited man hesitated. We don't want trouble. We just need answers, one said. Out of answers, T-Bone replied. But I've got a beating out back, free if you want it. Realizing they were outnumbered by armed men, one suit said, We're not getting Smith without a fight. The leader nodded. Let's go. They backed off, returned to their cars, and left, splitting directions. T-Bone turned to Bubba, dropping the accent. Where'd you get that line? Bubba shrugged. Seemed right. T-Bone laughed and radioed. Costumed guys left, 1 north, 1 south. Got it, said Alpha 1's voice. Regis called out, Eagle 1, track those SUVs. Copy that, a voice replied. We're watching them good, Regis said. Regis hung up and glanced at John and Houston. Let them simmer for a bit, he said. They're clearly waiting for you to leave, he added. I know, John replied. What's our next move while we wait? Regis asked. Houston, now we start working on filling in all the missing pieces, he said. Houston looked surprised. What missing pieces? She asked. Trust me, Regis said. You might be a little naive, but you're definitely not stupid. You've got an above-average memory, and I know there's a lot of information locked in there. It's time we accessed it. What do you mean? She questioned. We'll use a form of hypnotherapy to help you remember, Regis explained. The firm has been programming you over the past few months. The pills they gave you for the last couple of weeks were part of this. We need to undo this damage. I'm certain that once we do, you'll recall much more than you realize. Will it hurt? She asked. Regis shook his head. Not at all, he replied. We've made great strides in recent years. No one's performed a lobotomy in ages, he added with a smirk. John knew this was Regis's dark humor, but it startled Houston, who looked to John for reassurance. Regis chuckled. I'm just kidding, he said. You'll be fine. I'm also interested in figuring out what they dosed you with. He picked up the phone, spoke a few words softly, and hung up. What now? John asked. 2 gentlemen will be here shortly to take Houston to our mental health specialist, Regis said. You can go with her if you'd like. I'd like that, John said. Will you stay with me? Houston asked him. Of course, he replied, taking her hand. A few minutes later, 2 men in white coats entered with a wheelchair. Houston sat down, and they left the room. They've been there too long, the lead enforcer told Linda as he watched the entrance. No movement had been seen for hours, and the 4 men were growing anxious. All right, she said. We know where they are. Head back to base. We'll catch up with them later. The call ended, and the SUVs turned around. Linda put the phone down and looked at George. They couldn't get the Smiths back, George asked. Linda nodded. No. What's the update on Greg? She inquired. George shook his head. Not great, he said. His injuries are worse than expected, and he might not make it through the night. What's next? She asked. Should we take them and bring them here? No, George replied. We'll move them to the beach house. How do we get them there? She asked. I'll leave that to you, George said. Houston mentioned she wanted to resign. Let her do that, and make sure it won't cause any issues. She's gullible enough to trust you. Her husband will probably want to come along. Let him get security ready to grab them both. I need to find out how much he knows about our operation. Why does this matter so much? She asked. I thought he was just an insurance company programmer. George shook his head. That's not all he is, he said. I just don't know how much more he knows. So you're using Houston as bait, she clarified. He'll spill everything once he realizes how serious this is, George replied. He'll do anything to save her. I hope you're right, she said. George smiled. Trust me, I am, he said. Just make sure the house is set up. You tried to make him complicit willingly, he continued. Now we'll make it unavoidable. Once we're done, we'll hand him off, and he'll die with a little assistance from us. She smiled at the idea and left the office. What they didn't know was that their conversation had just been recorded and sent to alpha servers. John sat in the waiting room while his wife underwent the hypnotherapy Regis had mentioned, meant to unlock her memories. He had been waiting for over an hour when Regis entered. Do you have a moment? Regis asked. John looked up. Of course, he said. Any idea how much longer it will take? John asked. At least 2 more hours, Regis replied. John nodded and stood up. Regis let him out, and John followed. They soon found themselves in Regis's smoking room, a well-ventilated space with armchairs facing an artificial fireplace. Regis just sat down and gestured for John to join him. He opened a small case and offered John one of his fancy flavored mini cigars. Thanks, John said, and Regis just lit his cigar. I still can't believe they let you smoke in here, John remarked, enjoying the sweet aroma. Well, this place is built to withstand a direct nuclear hit. I think a few cigars won't hurt, Regis said with a shrug. John chuckled as Regis handed him a folder. John opened it and skimmed through the medical report, which didn't make much sense to him. What is this? He asked. It's the report from your wife's blood tests, Regis said. Look at the 2 marked areas. One indicates a restraint pill, and the other is a compound I haven't seen in a long time. What's that? John repeated, frowning. In small doses, it makes someone highly susceptible to suggestion, Regis explained. Paired with the restraint pill, I'm guessing Houston was on edge. They could have suggested she do anything, and she likely would have complied. Honestly, it's surprising she managed to hold on this long. There's a federal agency monitoring this substance, and they've sent one of their top agents. He'll be here this afternoon, I see. Anything else? John asked, taking a puff of his cigar. Yes, Regis replied. Omega is planning to capture you both at their first opportunity. We already knew that, John replied. This time, it's permanent, Regis added. From the footage we received, they plan to sell you to a Middle Eastern buyer and stage your deaths. What's the plan? John asked. We're not going to let that happen, Regis said. We have people watching them, and we'll know when and where they'll move. I have a conference call to discuss this. Can I join? John asked. Sorry, son. It's above your clearance, Regis said. Your main job is to stay close to your wife. John nodded, and they smoked their cigars in silence for a few minutes before John spoke again. Have you ever been married, Regis? He asked. Regis glanced at him and nodded. Yes, a long time ago, he said, the pain evident in his voice. What happened? John asked, if you don't mind sharing. The usual story, Regis said. Too much time at work, stress from fighting enemies, and keeping secrets from loved ones. You know how it is. John nodded. Yes, I do. It was too much for her. Regis sighed. One day, I came home to find she had left. She left a note saying she'd found someone else, someone who was home and open with her. I also found divorce papers. This was 15 years ago. I'm sorry, John said. Do you have kids? Regis said, 2 beautiful girls. Their mother took them, and now they call another man dad. I haven't spoken to them in years. They've probably forgotten me. But your situation might be different. I hope so. John nodded. Houston is a good woman, he said. Yes, she's naive at times, but she's smarter and stronger than you think, and she really loves you. God knows why. They both smiled. You need to be there for her, John. I know, John said, and he will. All right, Regis said, standing up. I need to make a call. Go to Houston, and I'll message you when I'm ready. Got it, John said. He finished his cigar, and after I just left, he went to check on Houston's progress. When he arrived, he was informed that she was almost done and would be out soon. John sat and turned on the TV, though his thoughts were elsewhere. About an hour later, the door opened and Houston walked out. She smiled when she saw him, and he noticed something different about her, though he couldn't place it. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I'm okay," she said, smiling. John turned to the technician who had treated her. "Is she free to go?" he asked. The technician nodded. "Yes, she can go. We're preparing the report for Alpha 1. "Thanks," John said, turning to Houston. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving. Want to grab something at the cafeteria?" "Definitely," she said. They went to the cafeteria and ordered bacon burgers with fries. "You seem different," Jan said as they sat down. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I feel better than I have in ages," she replied. "My head feels clearer." "Did you remember a lot?" he asked. "Oh yes," she said, her eyes bright. "I can't believe how close I came to betraying you. Can you ever forgive me?" "I think so," he said, opening the folder with the report. "What's that?" she asked. "Your blood test report," he said. "They found traces of a restraint pill and something meant to make you suggestible. You just said that with those pills, you must have felt like you were losing your mind." "Yeah," she nodded, eyes moist. "It was hell. Each day was a struggle." "And those stories Linda sent you?" he asked. "Did you read them?" She nodded. "Do you want to guess what they were about, or should I tell you?" "You can tell me," he said. "They were all the same. Husbands were weak, wives were promiscuous, and lovers were cruel," she said. "Husbands were humiliated, forced to watch their wives with other men and then clean up after them." "Did those stories excite you?" John asked. "I'm embarrassed to say, but yes, they did," she admitted. "Between those stories and what Linda, Greg, and the others said, I was constantly on edge. Now I understand. I was sedated and manipulated." "You just said it was amazing you lasted as long as you did," Jan said. "It wasn't easy, John," she said. "It felt like a battle between two parts of myself." Good Houston was saying, "No, don't betray your husband. It's wrong." While Bad Houston whispered, "Come on, let Greg have his way. John will never find out." "I'm glad you listened to Good Houston," Jan said. "Except for that last day," she said. "Would you really have gone through with it if I hadn't stopped him?" "Probably," she admitted. "No, that's not true." "Yes, I would have, and I'm so ashamed of it." John nodded. "You reminded me of who I really am," she added with a smile. "Will you ever forgive me?" "I think I can, considering everything," he said. "Just don't let it happen again." "I promise," she said. "I know I've been naive, but now I see everything more clearly." "I have one condition," John said, smiling. "What is it?" she asked. "You're going to show me how you use that toy one day," he said seriously. "You want to see me do that?" she said with a grin. "Of course," he said. "Why not? Maybe if you behave, I'll let you watch," she teased. "You're so mischievous," John said, but agreed. John's phone buzzed, and he checked it. It was a message from Regis. "Regis wants to see us," he told Houston. "Are you done with lunch?" She stood up. "Yes, I'm finished," she said, eating the last of her fries. John got up, and they walked to Regis's office. As they entered, they saw a man of average height in a dark blue jacket standing there. "John, Houston," Regis said, "this is Oscar Warren from the Home Front Security Task Force." Oscar met J.N. and Houston Smith, and they shook hands. Regis gestured for them to sit. "H Front Security Task Force?" J.N. asked. "What is that? I've never heard of it." "Most haven't heard of us either," Oscar said. "We're a public-private task force dealing with situations similar to what you're facing now." He laid out photos of 4 women on the desk. "Mrs. Smith, have you seen any of these women before?" Oscar asked. Houston examined the photos and pointed to one. "This one," she said. "Are you sure?" Oscar confirmed. "Yes, she said it was a couple of years ago, but I remember her talking to George and Linda," she added. "So George Black, the senior partner, and Linda Wharton, head of the executive support group," Oscar clarified. Houston nodded. "Yes. Do you know what they talked about?" he asked. "No, not at all," she said. "I assumed she was a client or potential client." "Have you heard of Ms. Or the Mutual Marriage Assistance Society? Oscar asked. Houston thought for a moment. Yes, I've seen that term in documents that passed my desk, but I didn't think much of it. The woman you identified was Pat Witherspoon, Oscar said. Does that name mean anything to you? No, it doesn't, she said. Oscar nodded. Who is Pat Witherspoon? Regis asked. She was the top Ms. agent, Oscar explained. She died about a year and a half ago while in custody. And what is MS? Regis asked. It started as a group punishing unfaithful husbands, Oscar said, but it evolved into something else. What worries me is what Witherspoon did within Omega MS. She was advancing a dominant political agenda. What does that have to do with a law firm involved in human trafficking? Regis asked. Good question, Oscar said. What do you know about the house on the coast? He asked Houston. The company has a place there, she said, but it's more than a house. It's a complex with a pier and a helipad. I've never been, but I heard it's walled with security gates. Top executives go there to meet clients or unwind. That's where George and Linda plan to take you, Regis said. Houston's expression darkened as she processed the information. Her eyes suddenly widened. What is it? Regis asked. I remember a coworker mentioning a party she attended there, Houston said. She described it as wild, with illegal substances and all sorts of things. That's where they intended to sell you to a buyer, Reese said. We need to alert the White House, Oscar said. Regis nodded and turned to JN. Why don't you step outside with Houston for a moment, he said. John stood and gestured for Houston to follow. Once outside, Houston spoke. What did Reese mean? She asked him. Linda and George were going to make you a Z's slave, he said. And from what I've heard, they plan to eliminate me too. Oh my God, Houston said. What will they do now? I don't know, he said. We'll have to wait. They didn't wait long. A few minutes later, the door opened and Regis called them back in. Once they were seated, Regis pressed a button on his phone. We located the coastal complex, Regis said. You were right. It's walled and has a security gate. There's activity there. He pressed another button, and a video feed of the complex appeared on the screen. How are things on site? He asked into the phone. We've got everything covered, said a voice. There are 6 people in the main building. 2 arrived by helicopter a few minutes ago. 4 seem to be security guards. 1 is a woman and the other an older man. It's probably George and Linda, Houston said. Understood, Regis said. Await further orders. He pressed another button, and a different voice responded. Eagle 1, said a man. Eagle 1, this is Alpha 1, Regis said. Do you have eyes on the target? Affirmative, Alpha 1, the man replied. Armed? Regis asked. Fully armed, ready for action, the man confirmed. Regis grasped the significance. An agency drone equipped with 4 Hellfire missiles. Hold for my command, Regis said. Target the helicopter and demolish the main building. Understood. The operator confirmed. Houston's phone rang, and she saw Linda's name on the screen. She mouthed the name silently before answering. Hi, Linda. Houston, I think there was a misunderstanding earlier. I want to make it right, Linda said. Can you and John come to the coastal house? When? Houston asked. Now would be best. Can you make it? It's important to George and me, Linda replied. That's not going to happen, Linda. Not today, not ever. Actually, Linda, you can go to hell, Houston said, ending the call. She looked at Regis, who gave an approving nod. Take them out, Regis ordered. Once confirmed, they turned to the monitor. Yes, Houston shouted, her fist clenched in triumph. John smiled at her while Regis and Oscar exchanged quiet chuckles. It was a dramatic move, but we still need to deal with Omega, Regis said. Junk's expression grew serious, and Regis noticed it. John, are you worried about eliminating American citizens without a trial? He asked. John nodded. Yes, that thought crossed my mind, he admitted. They deserve it, Houston said firmly. I'm not arguing, John said, turning to Regis. So, what's your take? You're right to be concerned, Regis said. We should update you since you'll be involved in taking down Omega, he added, looking at Oscar. Oscar nodded and agreed. In fact, he said, addressing John and Houston, Do you recall the incident with the First Lady 6 months ago? Yes, they said. She had a stroke, John added. It was more complicated than that, Oscar said. She was part of a plot against President Skaggs. She failed and ended up dying from the same pill she intended to use on him. We're investigating who else was involved and believe Omega played a role. The substance found in Houston's system and her intel confirmed this. In short, Houston was targeted because she knew too much, even if she didn't realize it, Regis added. Add to that a Middle Eastern connection, he continued. The man George planned to sell her to has ties to regional terrorist groups. To them, she was a loose end to be dealt with. Who gave the order for their elimination? John asked. The directive came from the highest level, Regis said. But there's more to be done. John nodded. Understood. I'm in, he said firmly. George Black drove along the coastal road, thinking about what he planned for Houston. A grin formed as he imagined making John watch. Linda had always been reliable, and he was sure she would lure them to the beach house. Suddenly, he saw a police checkpoint and slowed down, rolling down his window. Sorry, sir, there was an incident ahead. The area is closed, the officer said. No one is allowed through, but I need to get to my house, George protested. Sorry, sir, the officer repeated firmly. You need to turn around. No one can pass until we get clearance. How long will that take? George asked, frustrated. Hard to say, maybe a couple of days, the officer replied. George's jaw tightened. With no other options, he nodded. Thanks, officer, he said, turning his car around. Glancing in his rearview mirror, he saw the officer speaking into his radio. A wave of unease hit him. He pressed a button on his car's console to call Linda, but it went straight to voicemail. She never missed his calls. He hung up without leaving a message and called another number. We have a problem, George said when the call connected. His voice was tense. Return to the office, the voice on the other end instructed before hanging up. For the first time, real fear gripped George. What's the plan? John asked. Eyes on Regis. We have a meeting set near Omega headquarters, Regis said, handing John a slip of paper with an address. Black is headed to one of our outposts, so he'll be there within the hour. Oscar and some of our agents will meet you. I'm coming too, Houston said. John turned to her, surprised. Why? It's dangerous. I don't want you hurt, he said. It's my choice, she said firmly. I need to be by your side. You're my husband, and we face this together. John studied her and saw the determination in her eyes. He looked at Regis, who nodded. She's part of this, Regis said. John sighed and turned back to Houston. All right, he said, but follow my lead. Understand? Understood, she said. They left Regis's office and returned to John's car. Oscar and his team followed in an SUV. The ride back was mostly silent, but John's mind was busy. He felt proud of Houston's newfound strength, but couldn't shake his worry. They arrived at the location Regis had given them, a mobile command center packed with electronics. John parked the car, stepped out, and opened the trunk. He pulled out bulletproof vests and handed one to Houston. What's this for? She asked. I don't want you getting shot, John said. Remember to follow my instructions. I understand, JN, she replied with a slight smile. I'm not clueless, you know. John smiled and kissed her. I know. Their moment was interrupted by a loud voice. Smith, called a large man in a dark uniform. Yes, JN and Houston answered at the same time. The man looked at Houston, then back at John. I'm John Smith, John said. Special Agent Jones, FBI. The man introduced himself. The briefing is starting. JN, Houston, Oscar, and the rest of the team gathered around a large table as Agent Jones outlined the operation, explaining the building layout and their plan to reach the top floor. As he spoke, Houston raised her hand. Yes, Jones asked, a hint of irritation in his voice. I have a pass that gives access to the top floor, she said. Wouldn't that be simpler than your plan? John couldn't help but grin as Jones's face reddened. After a moment, he exhaled and nodded. All right, Mrs. Smith, we'll use your pass. You'll lead us to the top floor. She gave a confident smile. When the briefing concluded, Jones asked if there were any questions. The room was silent as everyone shook their heads. All right, let's move out, he commanded. Heavily armed agents took their positions. John double-checked his gear, ensuring his pistol was loaded. Houston noticed his intense expression. "Am I making you nervous?" she asked. He looked up and smiled. "Not at all," he said, hugging her. "I'm proud of you. I don't think anyone has shut Jones down that quickly before." They shared a quick kiss, and John resumed checking his equipment. Oscar joined them, and they headed toward the building on the top floor of Omega headquarters. George sat at a large conference table, stunned, as Jim Bradbury, the board chairman, spoke. "What should we do now?" George asked, panic in his voice. "Destroy all the evidence, you fool," Jim snapped. "I warned you this would be a mess if you didn't plan ahead. Now let's get moving." Before George could respond, a large man in a dark suit entered. "We have a problem," he said, looking at them. "The FBI is here." "What?" George said, eyes widening. "The FBI?" the man repeated. "They're all over the building. Head to the roof," Jim ordered. "It's too late," the guard said. "The FBI has already secured the roof." "Damn it," George muttered. "What now?" Their conversation was interrupted by the door bursting open as FBI agents stormed in. The guard reached for his weapon, but an agent disarmed him before he could draw. John, Houston, and Oscar entered, backed by armed agents. John stepped forward, eyes cold as he looked at George. "Now it's your turn to be someone's toy, in prison," he said. Houston walked up to George and punched him in the face. "I quit," she shouted, eyes blazing with anger. John cuffed George and read him his rights, while Oscar did the same to Jim. Agents spread out, collecting evidence and detaining other Omega executives. John's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. "Al calling." Smith answered. "Great job, John," Regis said. "Thanks, boss," John replied. "Take the rest of the week off," Regis suggested. "On Monday at 7 a.m., Houston starts her training," John repeated, surprised. "Yes," Regis confirmed. "I want your new partner ready for fieldwork." "Partner," John echoed, stunned. "Absolutely," Regis said. "You two make a good team. Now, go enjoy your time off." John ended the call and looked at Houston, who was watching him curiously. "Is everything okay, honey?" she asked. "Yes," he said, a smile breaking out. "We just got the weekend off, and then you start training." "Training?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," he said. "You're going to be my new partner." A bright smile spread across her face as she hugged him. "Partner, huh? I love the sound of that." "Come on, Mr. Smith," she whispered teasingly. "I want to celebrate with you." "That sounds perfect," John said. They walked out of the building, hand in hand, ready to start a new chapter together. The senior Omega members were tried in federal court and found guilty on all charges, receiving maximum sentences. Women from the executive support team testified, securing the convictions. Greg never recovered from his coma and died of a heart attack on the day the final guilty verdicts were announced. 2 months later, John and Regis stood in the gallery watching Houston train with her combat instructor. She was no longer the naive woman John had married, but a confident and capable fighter. JK's chest swelled with pride. "Regis, I have a question," John said, eyes on Houston. "What's that?" Regis asked. "Did you do something during her hypnotherapy?" John asked. "No," Regis said. "This is the real Houston Smith. We just helped her unlock her inner strength." "You haven't changed your mind about her being my partner, have you?" John asked. "Not at all," Regis said. "I'm excited to see you both in action." John nodded, satisfied. "What next?" he asked. "Not yet," Regis said with a smile. "Once she's finished training, you'll find out. But for now, why not take her out for lunch?" "Good idea," John said. He walked down to the gym as Houston finished her session. She saw him, wiped her brow, and jogged over with a grin. "How's I do, partner?" she asked, giving him a quick kiss. "You were great," he said, chuckling, "but maybe a shower before lunch." She laughed and playfully touched his arm. "After lunch, I want to check out the shooting range," she said, eyes glinting. "Mind if I use your tool?" she teased. "You're in a playful mood today," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Just wait until tonight," she said, winking. She had always been spirited, but training had made her fierce and confident. John watched her head to the showers, admiration in his eyes. Life, he thought, was about to get very interesting.